Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to be looking at the 10th and final session in our Complete Christmas series. I had originally intended to get this done before Christmas, but unfortunately, with my work schedule, I'm only able to be here every alternate Sunday, and the way that interacted with our hosting of IBC Praise and the Wonderland of Carols program pushed us into the new year. And in 2022, the Connect class is coordinating with the other educational classes. So that's conspired to make session 10 an online exclusive. So that's what we'll be addressing today. The last time we were together in session 9, we talked about the visit of the Magi. The visit of the Magi is recounted in the first half of chapter 2 of Matthew. In the second half of the chapter 2 of Matthew, we'll find that there are 3 other events that are dealt with, that being the flight to Egypt, the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem, and the return to Nazareth. It was originally my intention to deal with all 3 of these, but as I continued to research and my notes grew and grew, I eventually decided it would be better to just address one of them and to do it in the detail and depth that it deserved, as opposed to try to address all 3 and abbreviate them to the point that they would fit our time. So before we even do that, I do want to go back and review a table that we originally looked at in session 1. So session 1 was way back in July of 2021, if you can believe it. So I just want to take a quick view at this again. We knew we were going to be spending a lot of time in the Gospels during this series, so we looked at some of the background of these authors, and we talked about how Matthew was of the tribe of Levi. So he was Jewish from the priestly tribe, not a priest himself, but presumably from a background of precision when it comes to dealing with the scriptures, what we would call the Old Testament. And Matthew's audience was primarily a Jewish audience, people he could assume were familiar with the Old Testament. So when you read Matthew, Matthew takes your knowledge of the Old Testament for granted. He's going to treat that as a starting place from which to begin discussing things. And because he's speaking to primarily a Jewish audience, his presentation of Jesus is primarily as the Messiah, the coming King of Israel. So in Matthew, you get primarily Christ the King. This is as is compared to Mark, who primarily presents Jesus as the servant of God. This not only fit better with his Roman audience's concept of authority, but also fulfills those prophecies that tell us that Messiah would be a suffering servant, despised and rejected. Dr. Luke, the Gentile, concentrates on Jesus's humanity. In Luke, you get Christ the man. And in John speaks primarily to the church, and he focuses on the divinity of Christ. So in John, you primarily get the presentation of Jesus as God himself, wrapped in flesh and dwelling among us. So with that being reviewed, what we're looking at is in the second chapter of Matthew. And Matthew, with his Jewish orientation, he's going to couple each of these events, the flight to Egypt, the slaughter of the innocents, and the return to Nazareth, with an Old Testament passage that he's going to say is fulfilled by that event. So first, Joseph is warned in a dream to flee to Egypt because Herod's going to seek Jesus' life. And we read in Matthew 2 and 14 and 15 that when he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. So Matthew doesn't tell us what prophet he's quoting from, but a quick survey of the Old Testament will show that that's from Hosea 11 and 1, right? Hosea 11:1, when Israel was a child, then I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. Now, we could go pretty in depth into that passage and what it means. We're not going to do that today. Suffice it to say, for our purposes, that it's relatively easy to find where Matthew was quoting from in this instance. He goes on to describe where Herod sent soldiers to kill all the children 2 years old and under in Bethlehem. And in Matthew 2 and 17 says, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah the prophet, saying, in Ramah there was a voice heard, lamentation and weeping, great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and would not be comforted because they were not. So in this instance, Matthew even tells us where he's quoting from, that this is from Jeremiah. And indeed, what he gives us is basically a word-for-word quote of Jeremiah 31 and 15. And after Herod dies, Mary and Joseph and Jesus return from Egypt back to Nazareth. And in Matthew 2 and 23, we're told, "And he came and dwelt in the city of Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene." So Matthew, again, doesn't tell us where he's quoting from, which is not unusual. What is unusual is he says, "as was spoken by the prophets," plural. So we know that we should find this multiple places, that multiple prophets said this. What's even more unusual is when we do our survey of the Old Testament looking for a prophecy that says Messiah shall be called a Nazarene, we don't find any, at least not in those terms. So Matthew tells us we should find this multiple places, and in fact, we can't find it at all. So we know something, we're going to have to dig deeper here. Something else is going on. This is what a Jewish rabbi would call a remez, a hint of something deeper, someplace we know we're going to have to work a little harder. We know God is a rewarder of those that diligently seek, so let's dig right in. So since we don't find these specific terms that Messiah is going to be called a Nazarene, one of the first things we might suspect is that there's wordplay involved. If you remember, we spoke in in session 3 when we talked about the kings that were excluded from Matthew's genealogy. My belief that the Holy Spirit does engage in wordplay, in puns. Hebrew is very likely the original language, the language that everyone spoke before the Tower of Babel. And as such, it has some special properties. First off, every letter is a number, such that every letter and every word have a numerical value. This means that Hebrew is given to codes and ciphers. Also, if we understand how Hebrew was written before the Babylonian captivity, so-called Paleo-Hebrew, before the block lettering, we'll understand that each letter is also an ideogram. So not just a phoneme telling you the sound your mouth should make, like letters in English, but each letter actually representing an idea, such that about 60% of Hebrew words, especially the ancient ones, you can decipher their meaning from just the buildup of the letters that they contain. And also, Hebrew is a very expressive language, a very dynamic language. It's very given to poetry, very given to wordplay, and given to puns. So we think that this phrase, that he shall be called a Nazarene, because he's from Nazareth, is some sort of wordplay. One of the first things we might think of is of a Nazarite, right? Like the Nazarite vow that Samson took. But you investigate this path and you'll very quickly find that there is also no prophecy that the Messiah would be a Nazarite. And in fact, looking at Jesus' life as presented in the Gospels, it'll quickly become apparent that he was not a Nazarite. So that, while the words are similar, must not be what Matthew's referring to. One of the other things we've discussed before in this class is that Hebrew names are all based on these 3-letter roots, the same 3-letter roots that form the core of words, so that every name can be said to mean something. So Nazareth, the name of this town, is based on a 3-letter root that is the same as the Hebrew word netzer. And netzer means branch, such that Nazareth could literally be said to mean branch town or sprout town. So I think perhaps this is a double reference, right? Jesus is going to be the Nazarene because he's from Nazareth, branch town, but also because he is the branch. So we look for this word netzer in the context of messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. We do find one. We find it in Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 1, where it says, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." So there we have that word branch as netzer, and this verse is going to be pretty clearly messianic when we understand who Jesse was, right? So Jesse was the father of King David, right? So the root of Jesse is the root of that Davidic royal line. So the branch out of the root of Jesse is going to be that coming king of the Davidic line, which very clearly fits what we know about the Messiah. And if we're curious as to what time this is talking about, Isaiah chapter 11 goes on to talk about the wolf dwelling with the lamb and the calf feeding with the bear, and none shall be harmed. So talking about a time when the curse has been lifted, when there's true peace on earth, that time that Messiah is actually ruling on earth, on David's throne. So we're pretty confident we're on the right path here, right? We found a reference to the branch that is pretty clearly messianic. But if we keep looking for instances of this word netzer, we find it a couple other times, but not in anything that would be considered messianic. Now, Matthew said that as was spoken by the prophets. So we know we're looking for more references here. So we think maybe this wordplay goes even further than we thought, because netzer means branch, but there are other Hebrew words that also mean branch. In fact, in its ancient usage, netzer almost exclusively referred to the branch of an olive tree. It had a near synonym called simic that had some broader use in the ancient uses. And actually, we know from some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that by Matthew's time, by the first century, these two words were used completely interchangeably, netzer and simic. So if we look at this other word for branch, simic, and take a look, we do find some more prophecies. In fact, the first one we find is in Isaiah chapter 4 and verse 2, where we read, "In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel." So, branch of the Lord. Let's talk for a moment about Isaiah. Isaiah is probably the most eloquent of all the prophets. He certainly has the highest Hebrew, the most extensive vocabulary. But despite his eloquence, he doesn't sugarcoat anything, right? He tells it like it is. He starts his book right out from the beginning, giving a report card of the people, outlining exactly what they've done that sinned and displeased God. And he launches from that right into a description of the punishment that's going to befall them, the calamity and the destruction that's going to result from the people's sin and disobedience. But in chapter 4, we start to get what could be seen as consolation. And this is a common pattern, not just in Isaiah, but also in prophets generally, right? That you have a description of sin, a description of the punishment for sin, but then a reminder that through it all there will be a remnant, a faithful remnant, and all the things that God promised are still going to come to pass through that remnant. God is God of his word. Everything he said is going to still be fulfilled. So Isaiah, he writes at about the same time that the northern kingdom, Israel, is being conquered by the Assyrian Empire. So this is about 120 years before the southern kingdom, Judah, is going to be conquered by the Babylonian Empire. And so about 190 years before there'll be the return from that exile, just to put you in the concept of his timing. And another thing we've talked about in this class before is this idea that there is prophecy in the pattern, right? Most of us are from a mostly Western background, so our conception of prophecy will be primarily a Greek one, that prophecy is a prediction and a fulfillment. But to the Semitic mind generally, and to the Jewish mind specifically, prophecy was in the pattern, right? God would do a thing a certain way to set a precedent, so that when he did it that way again, you would recognize that this was the hand of God, right? He spoke in types, in foreshadows. There was prophecy in the pattern. And one of the things that results from this is that most prophecies have multiple fulfillments. And I don't just mean different guys having different ideas of what a prophecy means. I mean literal multiple fulfillment. So a lot of times a prophecy will have a local fulfillment, but then it'll also have a more global, more universal implication. Sometimes there'll be a fulfillment that comes to pass within the prophet's lifetime or a few generations after. But then there's also a far future, even a messianic or an in-time fulfillment. And then sometimes there is a fulfillment that is a practical, literal fulfillment, but then there's also a spiritual aspect, right? A way in which that prophecy could be said to apply to the life of every believer. Right? And these things happen because God works in these patterns, right? So a prophecy of the first time the pattern occurs is a prophecy of the next recurrence also. It has the practical upshot of validating the prophet, right? Because the more local, more practical fulfillment, the one that takes place soon after the prophet's lifetime, lets the people know that this was a true prophet of God that spoke the truth, so that their words are preserved, so that we have them to read for their more far future, more universal applications. So a theme that comes up a lot in Isaiah is this idea of the escaped of Israel, or the idea of the remnant. And sometimes he is referring to those that are going to remain faithful from the northern kingdom throughout the Assyrian conquest. And sometimes he's talking about those of the southern kingdom who are going to remain faithful through the Babylonian captivity. But almost always, he is also talking about that remnant that's going to remain faithful through the time of Jacob's trouble, what we would tend to call the Great Tribulation, and see the reign of Messiah. So this verse, right, in that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. This is a verse that could be said to have had a partial fulfillment in the return from Babylon, where the fruit of the earth could be seen as literal agricultural abundance. But obviously it hasn't had a complete fulfillment yet, because the branch of the Lord, the Messiah, was not present during that time. And this passage actually goes on to discuss that the Shekinah, the visible glory of God as cloud by day and fire by night, will surround Mount Zion and create a shade for the people there. That clearly also has not happened yet. So a verse that's had a partial fulfillment, not yet a full fulfillment, and reminds us that prophecy is in the pattern. So this gives us two verses now that we've included Semic, but we've still just been looking in Isaiah. So we've still only had one prophet. So if we go on and continue to look, we'll find that this word Semic also occurs in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 23, verse 5, the beginning of this verse, Jeremiah writes, I should say, about 100 years after Isaiah. So he's writing during the lead up to and during the time that the Babylonians are conquering the southern kingdom. And in the beginning of chapter 5, in the beginning of chapter 23, he denounces the evil pastors that scatter the flock, by which he's referring to the evil leadership. But then in verse 5, he promises that good leadership is coming when he says, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. So again, this is one that is pretty clearly messianic. It makes reference of a branch unto David, so a descendant of the royal Davidic line, and also that this individual, the branch, will be a king. So could not get more plainly messianic. And because of that, while we're here, I can't help but go on and read verse 6 as well, because in talking about this individual, it goes on to say, In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name, whereby he shall be called, the Lord our righteousness. Now, as many of you may know, especially hopefully those of you who are with us at the beginning of 2021 for our I Am series, Lord, when it's in all capital letters like this, is the King James translator way of letting us know that the underlying word is Yahweh, the proper personal name of God, such that the Lord our righteousness is in Hebrew, Yahweh Sitkanu. And I emphasize this because as you continue your study of the Word of God, as you grow in the knowledge of His Word, you'll end up reading a lot of things, and you'll find that there are good commentators and there are bad. There are people for whom the Bible is simply archaeology, and there are those who are true believers. But don't entertain for a minute this idea you'll find out there that the concept that the Messiah would also be God Himself is a New Testament concept that didn't come about until Jesus was already on the scene, because we read right here in Jeremiah that this branch out of King David will be the Lord our righteousness, Yahweh Sitkanu, the Lord Himself. So that gives us two different prophets that have mentioned the branch. So we're pretty confident we're on the right track with what Matthew was talking about. But to be exhaustive, we can keep looking for this word Semic, and we actually find that there are two more mentions. And these both occur in the book of Zechariah. Now, Zechariah writes later still. He is writing during the time of the return from Babylon, while they're building the second temple, what's called Zerubbabel's temple, and later Herod's temple after Herod remodels it. But they're not different. It's still the second temple. And Zechariah, he starts out his book by describing a series of visions that he had all in one night, so sometimes called the night visions. And the contents of these visions are pretty apocalyptic, right? They're pretty clearly relating to the end times. In fact, they're reminiscent of things that you would find in the book of Revelation. And when you take into account that these are men putting spiritual visions into practical language, they may even describe some of the very same events that are described in Revelation. Even if you want to split hairs and say that they're not exactly the same event, they're clearly from the same time frame, right? From the Great Tribulation and the Apocalypse. And during these visions, in chapter 3, 3 and 8, Zechariah says, "Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, thou and thy fellows that sat before thee, for they are men wondered at." Now, Joshua the high priest was a real man. He was really the high priest during Zechariah's time, during the building of the Second Temple. But in chapter 3, we're not dealing with the real man, we're dealing with a vision. And we're told that he and his fellows are men wondered at. This is a little awkward in the English because you're trying to translate directly a Hebrew expression for which there's no direct English equivalent. But what's basically being talked about here is that these are men of portents, or men of symbolic significance. So we talked about how God uses types and foreshadows. He puts prophecy in the pattern. Usually, it's more subtle than this. But in this case, the text just comes right out and tells you this man, Joshua the high priest, is going to be a type. He is symbolically significant of something else. He's a man of portents. And the context in which he is symbolic, if we finish the verse, "For they are men wondered at, for behold, I will bring forth my servant, the branch." So Joshua is going to be symbolic, and it's going to have to do with God bringing forth his servant, the branch. So if we move forward into Zechariah chapter 6, Zechariah finishes the description of his visions, and then God sets him a task. So we're no longer in the visions. This is something that Zechariah is actually instructed to do. And it says in in chapter 6, verse 11, "Then take silver and gold and make crowns, and set them upon the head of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest." So this, putting a crown on a priest's head, is clearly a symbolic act, because a crown is the right of a king, and priests could not be kings. They were to be separate. The Bible is very specific about this, right? Priests came from the line of Levi. Kings came from the line of Judah. If you are curious as to how serious God was about this, you can look at 1 Kings chapters 12 and 13, or 2 Chronicles chapter 26, to find instances where kings overstepped their bounds into areas reserved for the priest, and just how seriously God dealt with those men. So we know this is clearly a symbolic act. We know that we were told Joshua is going to be used as a sign of something portentous. But let's make sure we're on the same page as to just what he is a symbol of, or a type of. First off, his name is Joshua. This is a transliteration of a name which in the Hebrew is Yeshua, right? So Yeshua, when transliterated directly from Hebrew to English, you get Joshua. If you were to instead transliterate it from Hebrew to Greek, and then from Greek to Latin, and then pronounce the Latin according to modern English rules, you would get Jesus. So Jesus and Joshua, it's the same name in the Hebrew, Yeshua. So he has this name, and after a series of visions that represent the tribulation and the apocalypse, he is then a priest who is also crowned king, right? So he is a priest and a king who's named Yeshua. So does anyone have any doubt as to who this man is being used as a type of? Okay? So we go on to read in verse 12, it says, "And speak unto him, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord." Verse 13, "Even he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and set and rule upon his throne. He shall be a priest upon his throne, and the council of peace shall be between them both." So he shall be a priest upon his throne. Driving it home, just in case you didn't get it in the buildup, that this man is both a king and a priest named Yeshua. He is also the man whose name is the branch. So we can be pretty confident here that we're on the right track in terms of what Matthew is saying, that Jesus, right, he was the Nazarene, both because he was from Nazareth and because he was the branch. And of course, we don't just know that the branch is a title of Messiah because Matthew tells us. If we look at the Targums, the rabbis were starting to talk about the branch being a title of Messiah as early as the end of the captivity. So before the book of Zechariah was even written, when they only had Isaiah and Jeremiah to draw from, they were already putting together that the branch was a title of Messiah. So because of that, obviously by the first century, this idea would have been well circulated. So amongst Matthew's target audience, a Jewish audience, this reference, which can seem like a subtle reference, or to us even an obscure reference, he could have been confident that his primary reader, an educated Jewish audience, would pick up on and know what he was talking about, that it would be fulfilled as was said by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. So that cleans up sort of our examination of Jesus as the Nazarene, but I want to go back now, if we could, and look at something else that we talked about in the first session back in July. Because in the first session, after we talked about the Gospels, we also talked a little bit about the camp of Israel. So we talked about how Israel camped when they were in the wilderness. So in the camp, the tabernacle was in the center. And the tabernacle was where the Shekinah, the visible glory of God, dwelt in the Holy of Holies. And around about the tabernacle, 3 tribes camped in each cardinal direction. So 3 to the east, 3 to the west, 3 to the north, 3 to the south. So you had 12 tribes organized into 4 camps. So in each group of 3 tribes, there was one tribe that was selected to be sort of the lead tribe, and the camp was named for them. So for instance, on the east, you had the tribes of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, and that was the camp of Judah. So from 12 tribes, you get 4 camps: the camp of Judah, the camp of Reuben, the camp of Ephraim, and the camp of Dan. And these 4 camps each had their own ensign or sigil or flag, if you will. And there's a story behind why each tribe has their flag, and if you're interested in that, you can get on the church's YouTube page and go to playlists, find Complete Christmas, and go to session 1 to go into that in some depth. But for here, it'll be suffice it to say that the ensign of Judah was a lion, the ensign of Reuben was a man, for Ephraim it was the ox, and for Dan it was the eagle. So camped around the tabernacle, you had these 4 signs: the lion, the man, the ox, and the eagle. So far, so good. In the Bible, we have a couple instances where authors were treated to a vision of the throne of heaven, and they describe that vision for us. The first is in Ezekiel, and in Ezekiel chapter 1, we're told, "Also out of the midst thereof came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man, and every one had 4 faces. As for the likeness of their faces, they 4 had the face of a man, and the face of a lion. On the right side, they 4 had the face of an ox. On the left side, they 4 also had the face of an eagle." So we see these same 4 images again: an eagle, an ox, a man, and a lion. Then in the New Testament, in Revelation, John is brought up into heaven to see. So I should say Ezekiel saw the throne of heaven descending to earth. John is actually brought up into heaven to see the throne. And in Revelation 4 and verse 6, it says, and before the throne there was a sea of glass, like unto crystal. And in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast was like a lion, the second beast like a calf, the third beast had the face of a man, and the 4th beast was like a flying eagle. So again, we have these same 4 images. Now, the language between Ezekiel and Revelation has switched from Hebrew to Greek, so you get ox in the one case and calf in the other, but trust me, in those original words, there is more than enough ambiguity to allow that they are talking about the same animal there. So we see this pattern repeated again and again. You say, wow, that must be significant, right? Because these living creatures are surrounding the presence of God on his throne, and these 4 symbols of the camps are surrounding God's presence in the tabernacle. So we think, okay, what could these symbols mean? Well, you think about a lion. A lion, even today, we refer to as the king of the jungle, right? The lion has adorned more royal crests through the ages than any other. The lion is the symbol of royalty, the symbol of a king, right? Then you have the man. For Reuben, not really a symbol, just a representation of humanity, of mankind. You have the eagle, like Dan. The eagle flies, is a solitary flyer. It soars higher than any other bird, gazing majestically down at creation. It has, from time immemorial, been used as a symbol of divinity, as a symbol of God. And then the ox. The ox is a symbol of strength, yes, but you think, what does an ox use its strength for? It pulls our plows. It carries our loads. The ox offers service, and it's a symbol of a servant. So you can see these symbols as being, the lion, a king, right? The man for humanity, the eagle, God, and the ox, a servant. So now if we go back and look at our table of the four Gospels, we note that Matthew presents Jesus primarily as a king like the Lion of Judah. Mark primarily presents Jesus as a servant of God, a servant like the ox of Ephraim. Luke primarily presents Jesus, the man, right? A man like the ensign of Reuben. And John primarily presents Jesus as God himself, right? God like the eagle of Dan. So these were things that we discussed in session 1. And I put them in session 1 at the beginning because I thought they were a great example of patterning, right? That prophecy is in the pattern. They were a thing that connected the Old and the New Testament, and it shows how the Holy Spirit is always at work, preserving the text, writing the end from the beginning. But that being said, I thought that in session 1 that was sort of a complete unit that we had discussed. I recap it so extensively here because we've just been through and looked at Jesus the Nazarene and looked at these branch prophecies. Let's go back and look at these branch prophecies once again. Isaiah 11:1. There shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Jeremiah 23:5-6. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch. Now, both those passages are talking about a branch that's a branch of David. David was the king. So that's the branch of a king, like the Gospel of Matthew and the Lion of Judah. We look at Isaiah 4:2. In that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious. Now that's a branch of Yahweh, a branch of the Lord, of God, right? Just like the Gospel of John or the eagle of Dan. Zechariah chapter 3. Zechariah chapter 3. I will bring forth my servant, the branch. That's the branch as a servant, like the ox of Ephraim and the Gospel of Mark. And finally, Zechariah 6. Behold the man whose name is the branch. That's the branch who's a man, just like the Gospel of Luke and like the ensign of Reuben. Now, I hope that blows your mind. Because it certainly blew mine when I got there. Because this connection is particularly special to me because as we've gone through this series, right, for 10 sessions, each one has had its own topic and its own subject. But the sort of overarching theme that's been woven through them all is this idea that the Bible is interconnected, right? Though ostensibly the Bible is a collection of 66 books by 40 different authors, right? In a larger sense, it has only one author, the Holy Spirit, and it is in fact just one message, integrated and whole from the creator of the universe to us, right? The Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. The New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed. And God is constantly speaking in these patterns, right? There's prophecy in the pattern where he's telling the end from the beginning. And while I was making this point, even making it specifically, right? What I didn't realize was that in session 1, I was setting up what would eventually come about in session 10. So even I, as I'm making the point that God writes from the end from the beginning, didn't realize that, in session 1, I had no idea what session 10 would look like. Apparently God did, because we laid the foundation that comes to fruition here in the prophecies of the branch in Jesus the Nazarene. So that's all I have for today. I do just want to close by thanking everyone again for staying with me throughout these whole 10 sessions, for giving me the opportunity to be up here. I know in the course of any given year, we only have 52 Connect classes, and between weather and illness and special services, maybe even fewer than that. And this past year, you've entrusted about a dozen of them to me. So I really do appreciate the opportunity. I hope I brought something worthy of the time I've been allotted. And thank you very much.